affairs. Facts and opinion. Their future in our hands. Markets. Globalist technocrats versus the people. A line in the sand. The McIntyre Report.
Hi there and welcome folks. Jamie McIntyre here on behalf of the Australian National Review with the McIntyre Report. Today let's talk about Trump-Biden issue. Will Biden last his term? It's getting so bad in America. Now even the Biden supporters would have to be shaking their head just how bad of a president do we have. How bad has he turned America into a third world country in the space of a few short years? And to kind of perfectly make sense, you know, because he's clearly the puppet. I don't think even Democrat supporters could argue that we're running a democracy here, really, because if it's a democracy, our supreme leader, of course, is Joe Biden. And the Western nations, including Australia and New Zealand, Canada and UK, Japan, Western Europe, etc., are the puppets of Joe Biden. And he's running the show, and he's the brains behind what they're planning to do with the climate change and the COVID pandemic response, etc. Now, of course, we know that's nonsense because Joe Biden can't even ride a bicycle. He can't even read the speeches that are created for him. He can't remember who his wife is, and he conveniently forgets the dodgy deals that his son has ensured he gets 10% on from Chinese companies. So Joe Biden, as we know, is a puppet. Let's accept that. So who are the masters? Well, some of these masters people such as George Soros. George Soros, a multi-billionaire, he's worth over $30 billion and has a history of, rigging elections. He's been rigging elections around the world, working with the U.S. State Department and many of the Democrats, like in Ukraine. We'll talk about Ukraine and Russia in tonight's episode. But if you look at that, he has an ability to do that quite well. So why wouldn't he have rigged the U.S. election? Now, George Soros is on record for stating that he wants to destroy America. He thinks America and the industrialized West is the problems with the world. Now, he has a society foundation, once again, like Bill Gates. They have these so-called foundations, which they claim to give money to charity. They're tax dodgers. It's a way of storing their wealth and using their wealth to manipulate world events. And open society. So generally what they call their foundations is the opposite of what they mean. If you look at the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it was originally called the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute of Population Control, and they would suggest that they should change that because it might highlight very clearly what it's about. So they changed the names of them. But Open Society Foundation by George Soros is nothing about open society. He's against democracy. And he started his career off working with the Nazis, dobbing in Jewish, even though he is Jewish himself, dobbing in the Jews to the Nazis in Germany as a teenager. He now is likely to finish his career once again working with the Nazis, the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. He organized an illegal armed coup of the Democratic elected president in 2014. But if you listen to the Australian media or Western media, the poor Aussie that comes home after work, sits down, watches Channel 7, 9, 10, or ABC, not really realizing these are propaganda channels, conspiracy channels, just like the Chinese citizens have always been amused or bemused by us Westerners, because in China, Chinese citizens know their news is often propaganda, but they're bemused why Westerners think our news is actually news. Now, Channel 7, 9, 10 follow ABC, BBC, CNN as fake news channels. They deliberately set out every day to deceive and push false narratives. That's one thing you'll never find with independent media. If we ever make a mistake, we make an inadvertent mistake, we can admit it. But we're not out to deliberately deceive you as a listener or a viewer or as a reader of the Australian National Review or our partner independent media sites. We're out there to speak the truth and find out the truth and share that without any bias. And yes, we are biased towards the truth. We're very anti towards propaganda. So, but if you listen into the West, you were told that Russia had an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And we know that to be completely false. And we'll talk about it. Let's hear from Putin. First, I want to share another poll result because I'm going to talk about this now. Biden is quite possibly may not last his term. And then the question is, will Trump come back? And we'll look at that in just a moment. But let's have a look at a poll. It's a poll to see who would you vote for. This is running right now. And obviously, if you want to vote on these polls, you go to Just follow me, Jamie McIntyre, on Telegram, or any of our threads, Australian National Review, or many of our other sister partner threads, and you'll see these polls and you can vote on them. But when we're asking who is the best world leader, isn't this fascinating? 80% have said Putin is the world's best leader. Now, if you listen to the West, they would be vomiting at that thought. Now, this is a poll, a lot of Australians and Westerners on our threads, but obviously more awake, more educated than the typical masses. 80%. Now, the other leader that's very popular is Bolsonaro from Brazil. He speaks very well. And Modi only got 10%, but they were the two. Now, obviously, we forgot the China leader here, but he wouldn't have polled too well. Anyhow, Biden got 0%. Now, this is a multiple answer choice. So you can choose more than one. And out of that, you look at the Western puppets. Biden, 0%. Anthony Albanese, Australia, 0%. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, 0%. Trudeau, Canada, 0%. Truss, who replaced Boris Johnson, 0%. Macron, France. These are all World Economic Forum leaders that have infiltrated the Western cabinets. They're all puppets. The only ones that got votes there are the ones that are not puppets. Now, whether you like Putin or not, if you don't like Putin, it's probably because you haven't listened to his interviews. It's probably because you've only listened to Western propaganda lying to you about what he's saying, lying to you about his intention. Now, we can tell. Now, this is not pro-Putin. This is just pro-truth. If you listen to Putin's speeches directly from the horse's mouth, then you can be a better judge of what you think he's saying. And then you can look at his track record. Is he congruent with what he's saying? Now, he made it very transparently clear that they weren't invading in Ukraine. They had a moral obligation after 8 years of appeasement, 8 years of war started by NATO in the West and their takeover of Ukraine, overthrowing a democratic elected president. Then they put in Poroshenko, and then Zelensky become elected after that. These are all puppets, right? Western puppets. As if the Soviet Union gave up Eastern Europe to allow these countries such as Ukraine and Poland, etc., to become independent. For the deal was the West would stay in the West and they would not encroach on Russia's borders. They didn't make these nations independent for the West to come and take them over in illegal coups and armed coups like they did in Ukraine. So for 8 years now, they've been funding a war, and Russia's tried to keep the Donbass, Lugansk areas, eastern Ukraine. It's part of Ukraine for 8 years under the Minsk agreements. This is all factual, and trying to achieve peace. But in that time, 15,000 innocent Eastern Ukrainians have been slaughtered by the neo-Nazis. Yes, there's neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Western media are trying to hide that, yet they used to admit that it was a concern. And by doing that, of course, they were preparing, and this is how Biden was going, Putin's going to invade Ukraine. How did he know that? Because they had amassed 150,000 troops on the edge of Donbass to invade Eastern Ukraine and to attack Russia. So Russia had no choice but to step in. One has a moral obligation, because if you don't understand, Eastern Ukraine, it used to be part of Russia. Many of them are Russians, Russian heritage, are loyal to Russia, and it used to be part of the Soviet Union. So many of them, they can't be just, they're being genocided because Ukraine decided to make neo-Nazis in Ukraine that they're second-class citizens and they wanted to wipe them out. So this is a war, a civil war effectively, and Russia stepped in out of the moral obligation and also to defend its borders. And they've said clearly what their intent. Their intent is to demilitarize Ukraine, so it's not a threat to the Russian borders, which is perfectly reasonable cause to do that, and denazify it, which is more than reasonable. What NATO and the West have done is not reasonable. An armed coup, overthrowing a democratic leader, starting a war, sending weapons in, and then propping up Zelensky, who's just slaughtering innocent Ukrainian civilians, sending them to the front line against an overpowerful army and Russian military, which is just destroying them with artillery. I mean, it's suicide. And Ukraine's losing. Ukraine's lost the war. They can try and create a stalemate and drag it out to try and the US has stated their intentions. It's to hurt Russia. It's a proxy war against Russia. Why do they want Russia? Why do they want Putin? Well, these are questions we need to understand. We've got to, first get rid of our brainwashing fed by Australian media that if you dare say anything maybe neutral or an alternative view about Putin or Russia, that you'll go straight to jail. Like Ozzy Kozak, Australian-born, Russian-born Australian, is in jail right now, no doubt because he's been highlighting the Russian narrative. They don't like that. We no longer live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy. It's very true. And let's hear what Putin said very quickly. I'll read that through to you, and then we'll go for a break. So here's Putin's speech as a couple of days ago. We read it. The policies adopted by the leaders of the US and its allies run counter to the public interest, which they're supposed to protect. This shows the Western elites, the oligarchs. These oligarchs he's talking to are the George Soroses of the world, the Klaus Schwabs. And behind those are the real masters, which is obviously it's going to link back to the Rothschilds family, the Rockefellers. And of course, it's going to be the oligarchs are going to be very rich, powerful people. True. It's not going to be a bunch of poor people. And they use the Democrats. I mean, they use both sides of politics, but predominantly Democrats, the CCP in China, etc., to manipulate world events. We can't argue that anymore. Just because you mentioned Rothschilds, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. No, it's not. Rothschilds exist. They have Mel Gibson's doing a movie on them now. I mean, you can study the history of money. They control the banking system, the Federal Reserve banking system. They rig the system in their favor. And their power is dwindling as Putin is highlighting. That's why they don't like Putin. Putin is standing up to the globalists. Putin is not one of them. He's anti-globalist. He's anti-World Economic Forum. Even though he's been invited to speak at it, he's made it pretty clear. And also, even though the central banks try and have control over Russia, he's changed a lot of that. They have a lot more control. And with Putin, Putin's in charge of Russia. Putin's not a puppet. There's not Russian oligarchs that telling him what to say. Does that make sense? Whether you like Putin or not, he's the man. What he says goes. Could you say that about Joe Biden? So we're so busy in the West, criticizing Putin's an authoritarian. It's not democracy. Hang on a minute. Did you see how the Victorian police treated Australians, bashed them in the streets, 86-year-old ladies, dragged pregnant mums out of their homes for posting on Facebook, jailed freedom activists and Monica Schmidt and others, tried to jail Rebel News independent journalist Avi Yemeni and others. I mean, this is not democracy. Have you seen Biden now weaponizing different agencies to jail critics of the Biden regime? They rigged an election. They stole the democratic process, helping with George Soros and help of the big tech companies like Facebook to manipulate the results. Now, whether you want to believe that or not, it doesn't matter. The evidence is there. The idea that Joe Biden could have possibly won when Joe Biden was speaking to 12 paid people at a rally, and then you've got still now Trump speaking to tens of thousands or 50, 60,000 people, energized supporters. Now, whether you like Trump or not is irrelevant. The point is he has a lot of support. But let's just continue with this, what Putin was saying. They decided to decouple. UE governments are a good example. They decided to decouple their economies from Russia, denying their businesses affordable energy and access to the Russian market. So they want to blame Russia for high energy prices, but it's Europe and the West that sanctioned Russia. So they can't say, oh, Russia's stopping sending gas to us. Well, you don't sanction their products if you want their products and you need their products. It's backfired. As I said, the Russian economy, I said, buy ruble like 5-6 months ago. It'll take off. Why? How did I know that? Because Russia is an energy commodities rich in resources. So anything that's going to drive the prices up is going to just mean the massive current account surpluses. The Westerners would be envy of the Russian economy. They want to bag the Russian economy. For the Russian economy, massive current account surpluses. Their inflation is going down. Their dollar is going up. Their economy, despite the greatest sanctions in human history, is surviving and actually was decoupling from the West, and a great opportunity for a lot of Russian businesses or friendly nation businesses to do well. Russia will do very well. The West is imploding. And this is what I'm suggesting. The oligarchs, the elites that Putin's talking about that control the West, that have their little puppets like Biden and Albanese and Jacinda Ardern, Macron, Trudeau, German leaders, etc. are manipulating world events, but the West is in decline. The rise of the BRIC nations, Russia, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and the monster amount of nations, including Indonesia, Argentina, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Middle East, that wants to join the BRICS and create a new reserve currency. What we're seeing is a shift of powers. It's the fall of the cabal, folks, and Putin, we should be very grateful because he has a military power and he's standing up to them. Putin is actually good. But don't take my word for it. I'm only interested in the truth, so should you. Let's listen to what he has to say. So Western sanctions fever hurts the world. Putin predicted that the American companies would lead the charge to capture the market shares of businesses based in the EU as a result, which they're obviously doing. The West deceives the poor nations. The global economic crisis will hurt vulnerable nations worst of all, according to the president of Russia. For many people, it's a life and death situation, which is true. They're going to starve, as impoverished countries will have no ability to buy crucial products. Meanwhile, Western nations pretend they want to help while only doing what is in their own interest, as exemplified by the Ukraine grain export deal, according to Putin. Russia agreed to help ships loaded with grain to leave Ukrainian ports under an arrangement mediated by Turkey and the UN in July. However, most of the ships have gone to UE nations rather than struggling countries, the president said. West deceived poor nations with the Ukraine grain deal, Putin. Just 2 ships out of the 87 that were loaded in Ukraine under the UN food program, which works to provide assistance to needy countries, just 3% were sent to developing nations. I mean, this is appalling. According to Putin, Western nations have decades and even centuries of experience in plundering colonies. You can't argue with that, and they are using the same approach today. In order to prevent humanitarian disasters, Russia suggests limiting the destinations for Ukrainian grain to change the situation. Russia is weathering the sanctions, he said. Russia is dealing with the damage caused by the West's economic, financial, and technological aggression relatively well, Putin said. He noted that the country's financial system had been stabilized. Inflation, as I said, in Russia is going down and unemployment is at record lows in Russia. Can't say that about America now, can we? Some companies were indeed hurt, especially those whose business depended on Europe in some way. He said that Russian government has mechanisms in place to support them. Asian nations want cooperation. So you've got to also understand is that in the West, we get fed propaganda that the world is against Russia. It's not true. Majority of the world's population and GDP is actually supportive of Russia and don't support the sanctions. We are blatantly lied to and misled because in Australia, we are a lapdog for Western US foreign policy, and the US is not run by America. When Trump was in power, whether you like Trump or not, Trump was in charge of America apart from the deep state trying to influence him. And even though we certainly don't agree with Trump pushing vaccines, Trump was a nationalist and believed in making America great again. What he said is what he meant. And the oligarchs and its deep state didn't like him. They control the Republican Party, but Trump stole the Republican Party effectively. And they didn't like that. They wanted a Hillary Clinton puppet. And they couldn't get her, so then they had to put up with Joe Biden. But I mean, Joe Biden is an embarrassment to the world. Imagine what the Chinese and Russian and Indian presidents must talk about behind closed doors and when the leader of the West is Joe Biden. I mean, it's a reflection of us, folks, and it's a very poor reflection of how dumbed down Western societies become to tolerate just inept, incompetent morons that are masquerading as politicians and leaders, particularly the Democratic Party in Australia. And the same could be said of the Labor Party in Australia, and both sides of politics in Australia are controlled by the globalists. So do you support globalists or don't you? Well, if you support the globalists, that means you're going to be you want to eat bugs and insects because beef will be banned. That means you're going to have an electric car that won't be able to charge or cost more to charge your electric car than it will for petrol. All these people that want to believe in renewables, which is a fraud, climate change, which is a fraud, and want to believe in these things, I say, well, if you really believe in those things, show some congruency like we expect of leaders, and go out and cancel your electricity account and wait for renewable energy to provide you with the energy that you want. If you really believe in renewables, go and ban, right? Why are we waiting 2030? Let's ban gasoline cars right now and rely only on electric vehicles. Let's ban coal-fired stations right now. Oh, that's what they are, trying to shut them down. We don't even have nuclear energy in Australia. Let's just shut it all down. If you really believe in renewables, just shut all that down, turn off your electricity account, and go about living with candles and firewood, like the Europe is going to have to do starting in a few months. That's how well let's check out California. I hosted Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of California, and even though I think Arnie has a lot of great points, I've been very disappointed in him. He's once again a globalist shill. pushing the vaccine mandate, and he was pushed the Green Deal in California. Now, there's a joke going around right now. What's the difference between the Titanic and the California economy? But the difference is when the Titanic went down, at least it had its lights on. California's going down. They can't even keep the lights on. It's $100 now to charge your electric vehicle in Germany. Do you realize just even if it was free to charge, you divide the cost of $10,000 to $20,000 for an electric battery to replace your car in every 10 years, the cost of that, it's not exactly cheap. And who's going to buy a secondhand electric vehicle that needs a $15,000 new replacement battery? They're of no value. You have to spend $15,000. You had a diesel or petrol car. Why don't they use technologies to make fuel more efficient and reduce the pollution from fuel? Wouldn't that be better for the world? Why don't we maintain cheap energy, or why don't we rely on nuclear energy, which is incredibly renewable, almost is effective renewable source and very environmentally friendly in comparison to everything else? But no, the Greenies won't have this, because the Greenies are a bunch of Biden supporters that are easily brainwashed and manipulated and are falling for the climate change fraud. It's not that we don't all want to help the environment. We don't want to look after our environment. I want to help the environment. The biggest issue the environment faces is the overfishing of the oceans. But and the pollution of our waters. But what's being done about that? Nothing. Signing up for the Great Reset, a globalist agenda, is not going to solve the environmental problems, nor is an overreaction, a deliberate overreaction to a falsified pandemic and vaccinating the world with deadly experimental drugs and introducing lockdowns and taking away people's civil liberties and human rights and ushering in a totalitarian police state. I'm not sure how that's going to help deal with the flu. My grandmother, when she was alive, we had the flu, made us some chicken cream soup. That was the solution. Today, global communism and don't dare be pregnant and a mum in your own home because the police in Victoria will send if you dare post on Facebook. I mean, Hitler would be like, was Hitler ever this bad? Interesting. Let's go for a quick break, folks. But let's just finish this right now. We'll go for a break. So I was reading Putin's speech. This is very important for you to understand, or your friends and family to understand. So Russia's dealing with the damage caused by the West, economic, financial, and technological aggressions we covered. And most of the nations of Asia Pacific reject the destructive logic of sanctions. Sanctions are only hurting the West. It's not hurting Russia to even 10% of how it's hurting the West. And to seek to foster business ties and economic growth for the benefit of the people. Putin said, Russia appreciates players that share its attitude to national sovereignty. Now, this is important. It's important because Russia supports national sovereignty. The globalists support a removal of national sovereignty, making the World Health Organization effectively a de facto world government where they can step in under a falsified pandemic. They can just call anything a pandemic and lock you up in a quarantine center, lock you down with what they're doing in China right now on your phones. They'll turn your pass from green to red, so you can't go to the bank and get your money because there's no money in Chinese banks and most of them. And society will collapse very quickly when the banks have a run on them, which in China could happen anytime already. Is happening, but a major run. Could that happen in the West, in America? America could turn to civil war. We've never seen, Australia is not out of this. So China's economy is now effectively in recession. That's not going to help Australian economy long term. We have high energy and commodity prices right now, which we benefit off, but we continue to be a lucky country. But how much longer will we be lucky for? Putin goes on to say, the abundance of countries like this in APAC is a great competitive advantage and a source of long-term development. Russia did not start the conflict in Ukraine, as I highlighted. When asked by the host for comments on how the crisis in Ukraine has affected Russia, he reiterated Moscow's position that the conflict was forced upon it. We did not start anything in terms of military action. We are trying to end it. Military action was started in 2014 following an armed coup in Ukraine by those who did not want normal development and sought to subjugate those who did not want normal development sought to subjugate their own people, carrying out one military action after another and subjecting Donbass citizens, that's Eastern Ukraine, to genocide for 8 years. About 15,000 Eastern Ukrainians have been murdered by neo-Nazis. I'll add to that. Russia decided to use military force 8 years later. Doing so was a moral obligation of the people of Donbass, who Moscow could not protect through the peaceful means. Putin said in the end, Russia will emerge from the conflict stronger domestically, internationally. He added. Now, you don't have to believe in what Putin is saying, but he is you just have to see what he says and see, does it match up to reality? And as you start to see a pattern, it does, And then you see that, hang on a minute, he is a more credible leader, more credible source of information than, say, Joe Biden, Anthony Albanese, Jacinda Ardern, Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, Macron, etc., who are just puppets that read from a script that is provided to them. And then that same script is provided to most of the mainstream media because they're controlled by the same people. Zelensky answers to the same people that Biden does, the same oligarchs. And so does Albanese. Albanese is a really strong alpha male that can protect our country. No, he's a weakling. He's what you call a pussy man, not to be derogatory, but I'm just highlighting the obvious. Is he the strongest leader this country can provide that has the balls to say it how it is? I don't think so. Has he gone out and built businesses? Has he worked hard in his life? No, their political career, I mean, they've never worked a day in their life. They wouldn't know what work meant. Let's go to a quick ad break, and we shall be back in just a moment.